Good afternoon. We're going to start this session, and welcome to this forum this afternoon. My name is Mark Manis. I'm with the United States Department of Agriculture. We have 4 speakers here today that will be making presentations. Charlotte Streck from Climate Focus. Next to Charlotte is Theun Vellinga from Wageningen University. Then we have Kenneth Kutsingia from Uganda National Farmers Federation, Selam Kidane from the Government of Ethiopia Environmental Protection Authority, and Bob Turlock, who will be our rapporteur from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So Charlotte, Theun, Selam, and Kenneth will be making presentations. And what I'd like to do is begin by giving a little bit of context and introducing what we're here to do today. If there's a way to fix this microphone, it keeps sliding down, that would be helpful. Thank you. So what we're here in a context of landscapes. So that approach includes notions of how we manage the land, how we address water issues, and forest and agriculture. And in looking at a landscapes approach, there are at least 3 contexts or elements that come to mind. One has to do with structure, the interaction between environmental features, land use, and patterns. Number 2 is the function, provisions of landscape functions for farmers and society. And number 3 is value, the value to society of agricultural landscapes. So in that overarching construct of the landscape approach, what we intend to do today is to focus on 1, mitigation priorities, 2, food security, and 3, how those 2 interact in the context of adaptation, because actually all 3 are thank you. Thanks. The falling microphone is how I feel because we're up after 3 o'clock this morning in negotiations, so I can identify with that. I'll try to stay awake. So we're coming at this from a variety of perspectives, and we have experts that bring to the forum interlocking but yet distinct perspectives. So Charlotte will be addressing the matter of mitigation opportunities in agriculture. Then Theun will be looking specifically at one construct for mitigation, and that's through a manure management initiative that's actually part of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition that we're about to initiate. And Theun will give us a very specific example of the issue of livestock and manure management. Then Selam will give us a policy perspective from the government of Ethiopia in which issues of adaptation, mitigation, and food security are addressed and considered by the government of Ethiopia. So that'll be another interesting perspective. And then rounding it out, we will have Kenneth, who will give a farmer's perspective on adaptation and mitigation and experiences and lesson learned. So we have a very interesting cross-section of perspectives within the broad context of landscape approach. So with that introduction, we will then proceed with the 4 presentations. And please, if you would, hold your questions to the end, and then we'll have a question and answer period, not only in the auditorium here at the university, but also my understanding is since we're online, we could very well be getting questions from the online audience. So we'll proceed on that basis, and thank you for your participation. So with that, I'll ask Charlotte to start with her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. So let's stop that loop here and go to my presentation. So just one comment, one explanation. In preparation of this session, we have been told that there would not be an opportunity to use a PowerPoint presentation. So instead, we were encouraged to prepare handouts. So now you have handouts of my presentation. However, when I figured out how expensive it is to do color copies, the handouts are in black and white. And so, which is suboptimal because they contain a lot of graphs whose meaning is disguised by the fact that it is now in black and white. Now, we arrive here and we can use PowerPoint. So I do use my PowerPoint, but now I apologize because the PowerPoint is a bit text heavy. More text heavy than I would use it as a presenter, but because I thought you have the handout and you can, this evening when you are home and you are bored and you want to have something to read, you can read the handout. So we need to, you know, apologize. I apologize in advance if I'm showing here now slides that contain a lot of text, and I encourage you to listen to my words and don't try to read them in parallel. So what I'm doing is, or what the organizers have asked me to do, is presenting the preliminary finding of a study that we do for CLUA, that is the Climate and Land Use Alliance, on international mitigation opportunities in agriculture. We have been contracted jointly with CEA, which is the California Environmental Associates, and I'm presenting now these findings on behalf of the team. The study is not concluded yet, so everything what I present here is preliminary. We will hopefully publish the findings beginning of next year. CLUA is the Climate and Land Use Alliance, is an alliance between 4 American foundations. That is ClimateWorks, the Ford Foundation, the Packard Foundation, and the Moore Foundation, that have over the last 3 years engaged in grant making in forestry and have supported the RED process, and now are evaluating their engagement in agriculture and in agricultural mitigation, recognizing that it is an important source of emissions, but also understanding or realizing that it is a complex sector with many fragmented sources of emissions and hence also complicated or possibly complicated mitigation strategies, but looking on where there is the main sources of emissions, what is the technical mitigation opportunities, and whether there is room for philanthropy in all this. We started the study with looking at the emissions and the technical mitigation opportunities. That part of the work has mainly been done by California Environmental Associates and Climate Focus, and part of my team is also here. We are looking now at the political economy of these mitigation opportunities and help to come to recommendations what potentially what the role of philanthropy in all this could be. Now, we realize, and this is the slide that I find, you know, that you can't really use it, right? So let's go right away to the next one because it is an insult on an audience to show that slide. And this one is mixed up between Mac and PC. Oh God, what is this? Maybe I shouldn't have used it. It looked good. So you have the combination of the handout and this slide may hold some information. What I wanted to say is that, of course, agriculture is a special, and it's a special sector, and looking at mitigation opportunities can never be done in isolation. Agriculture is essential for food security, obviously. That's the sector that feeds us. And in a situation where we still have a world where 1 billion people suffer from chronic hunger, that is an important and the most important consideration. It is essential for development. About 2.6 billion people work in agriculture, and for many developing countries, agriculture makes the biggest share, or this is the biggest sector in their GDP and in their economy, and normally the poorer a country is, the higher the agricultural share is. So it is an essential, it is intrinsically linked to development. Water use, 70% of the fresh water that we use is used for irrigation, for agriculture. So agriculture is using more fresh water, or we using more fresh water than for any other purpose. And it has, as driver of deforestation and as driver of land use change, it has important impacts on biodiversity and forest protection and forest ecosystems. It also has secondary impacts, like impacts on water, on rivers, and on marine ecosystems. So all this makes it a challenging and complex task. Also, when deciding on mitigation opportunities, one has always to consider important trade-offs in this. Now, about half of the emissions from agriculture come from direct agricultural production. Another half comes from deforestation, so from land use change, and emissions across the supply chain. And that is what this slide was trying to show you, is from direct, altogether we have about 10 gigatons, which is about 20 to 25% of the total global emissions, and about 5 come from direct agricultural production, and about 4 from land use, and then the rest from further down in the supply chain. Now, where are these, and what is the share, the global share on emissions, and where do they come from? Generally, the single biggest emitter is beef and cattle, making more than half of the emissions in Latin America and in Africa. That is enteric fermentation, mostly the biggest share in all economies, in all geographies. However, less than half in Europe, in the US, and in Asia. That is mostly also because in these geographies, agricultural soils are a big source of emissions, and in Asia, rice. So about a quarter of the emissions from Asia come from rice cultivation. This is again looking at the commodities. Oops. Beef, dairy, and rice are the commodities that have the largest emission impact from direct agricultural production. If we look at indirect impacts, so at land use change, then soy and palm are also important commodities. But it is, I think the most important message is that the livestock sector in general makes about 60% of agricultural emissions. So then when looking at mitigation opportunities, certainly also the question of shifts in consumption and in dietary changes is an important strategy. This is summarizing the technical mitigation opportunities, focusing on cattle and on different, in particular in Latin America, but also in Africa. In China, an important high source of emissions is nutrient management, and hence also one of the biggest or most important mitigation opportunity. Now, what are the? I need to sort here my many slides, lots of paper. So what are the approaches to reducing emissions from agriculture? One is, so what we identified or how we sorted is, one is shifting demand from agricultural products away from high carbon intensity products, such as livestock, to reducing the overall demand. Second is reducing the emissions intensity of agricultural production. And third is increasing the ability of agricultural lands, cropland and grazing lands to serve as carbon sinks. That includes the whole questions about soil carbon, which is, when you look at the literature, one of the most controversial parts, but in agricultural mitigation, big question on whether the numbers that have been published in earlier years are greatly overestimating that potential, but even with a corrected number, it's still important. In agricultural production, emissions can be reduced, most importantly, to reduce enteric fermentation. That is the single most important mitigation opportunity, but also improving the nutrient management, as I said, is relevant. Increase intensification, sustainable intensification is also an important strategy. Very difficult also to look at in the individual case because of many trade-offs, and if not done properly, it can actually easily lead to the contrary what is being intended. So needs to be carefully planned, but is something that is important. Then restore degraded lands, restore pastures is important. That is an overlap that is important also for sequestering more carbon in agricultural systems. And then we have, of course, what I mentioned already, the shift in demand, so the shift in diets, but also reducing biofuels demand as an important element here. So I skip the costs because that's another one of the heavy slides, but what I wanted to say, what is important is that we have very little reliable data on the cost because it is very context dependent. And the cost curves that exist, and often the most commonly known is the McKinsey cost curve, and we have tried to understand the assumptions, but we haven't. They are not disclosed, the assumptions. So, and considering that we have for a number of countries, for the US, for France, and for a number of others, we have country mitigation curves, but we don't have a real global understanding on what the costs are. However, there are some areas where there is cost negative mitigation opportunities, in particular in nutrient management, but also in grassland management. Others, like livestock supplements and additives, are costly and hold probably a much less significant mitigation potential. Now, the mitigation strategies that we look at now in more detail, so we have concluded this technical assessment. Then we have gone through and done country studies on the most important emitting countries, that is China, that is the US, that's India, that's the European Union as a whole, and Brazil. Looked at the political economy of the sector, who are the actors, what are the trade flows, where are the levers where one could potentially start, or where and how to influence it. Now we try to, in this last step of our study, we try to bring the two together and look in more detail now on strategies around shifting dietary trends, in particular in China, dealing with food waste, in particular in developed countries, so that's the US and Europe, improving the sustainability of biofuels, the sustainable intensification of agricultural production, in particular in India and Brazil, the restoration of degraded lands, and the reducing emissions from agricultural production, in particular in China, that is nutrient management, in Southeast Asia, that is rice, and the US and Europe. Then we have cross-cutting international strategies that we look at, that is improving or reducing the impacts of GHG impacts in the supply chain and changing agricultural finance, or bringing transparency to investors that invest in agriculture on the GHG, on the climate impact of their investments. That overlaps with that last strategy, which is increasing the traceability and MRV. Still, in this whole area, a lot of data are missing. It is often not transparent whether you look at the supply chains or you look in the agricultural system. Often or there is significant research needs and needs for transparency and tracing of emissions compared to other sectors. So this concludes my quick run through what we are doing for American philanthropy. We will update you on the final publication. And now time is over. Wasn't there a 1 minute thing or something? Oh God. So then very quickly, 30 seconds. I borrow this from Kenneth. You give me another minute, okay? Because you said you had only 10 minutes. We also do for CCAFs and IFPRI a study on an agricultural readiness process. This is another publication that is forthcoming, looking at what can be learned from readiness, so from the forest colleagues, for a process of agricultural readiness. That is not limited to mitigation. There we're proposing a readiness process that includes, that enables countries to develop strategies to invest in climate resilient, climate smart agriculture across and identifying needs for adaptation, potential mitigation needs, and hence enabling the countries to strategically use the climate finance, achieving food security in a climate resilient way, and identifying mitigation opportunities. As I said, we have we draw on lessons from RED, but realize that also that agriculture is very different, and adapt the conclusions or the process that we propose accordingly. Thank you, and thank you for the patience and the imperfection.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. So please hold your questions for the end of the last presentation by Kenneth, and now Theun will be making his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Mark. First, I would like to begin with, there is a similarity. I will speak about manure, by the way, but you already saw it on the slide. And there is a similarity between manure and money. Some people both consider it as filth, but there are more similarities. And one of it is, you know, that we say that when it's accumulated, it's really a pest, it's a plague. And well spread, it's a blessing. And that also holds here. And in fact, that will also be the basic thing of the presentation I will give you today. And, well, as you saw from Charlotte's presentation, well, when you look at greenhouse gas emissions, manure management is not such a big part. Well, okay, we did another study where it's maybe a little bit bigger, but you can discuss, well, why bother manure? Well, the point is that manure is not only a problem from the point of view of greenhouse gases. It's another problem. It's that we lose a damn lot of nutrients. And that holds for very large enterprises, like here you see an American feedlot somewhere in Texas, about 20,000 heads of cattle being finished here, and the gray spot down in the figure, that's all the manure that's collected from the feedlots, and that's on one big heap. And as I spoke to someone, he said, well, okay, then sometimes you have a big thunderstorm and then, oops, something is lost. Well, that's not a problem because then the heap is not getting too big. But this is not only the problem of very large enterprises, it's also the smallholder problem. This is close to Nairobi. And while you see some red spot there behind, that's a young guy, 25 years old, starting a two-cow dairy farm. But he has no idea what to do with the manure. So it goes there, and this is what you see still laying there. This is the solid part. The liquid part is already gone. So it means that we lose a lot of nutrients. And it's not only polluting groundwater, it's also that we lose nutrients as a fertilizer for crops. We lose organic matter, which is very important to maintain and improve soil quality, and it can also act as a source of energy. And when we speak about manure management, we speak about the complete chain, really starting with excretion, but then housing, anaerobic digestion, storage, treatment, and everything until application in the field or another use. And it means that we do not only focus on storage, we do not only focus on application, and anaerobic digestion is only a part of it. Because after anaerobic digestion, manure is still manure. Maybe a little bit different, nitrogen availability is a little bit different, but it's still manure. We didn't lose nutrients, we used some carbon, and that's it. And, well, in fact, we see that there are problems with manure. Its concentration, local nutrient overload, well, you saw it on the feedlot, but the same holds especially for monogastric production in urban regions. And then you can look at northwestern Europe, north of Italy, midwest of the United States, but also China, also South Asia, also starting in the south of, or in Brazil. And it's not only monogastrics, we also see it coming up with dairy and beef. And with dairy, also systems are getting footloose, and we see the problems with accumulation of nutrients in a limited area. But there's also a problem of handling manure. Liquids are not easy to handle, nitrogen is volatile, and anaerobic digestion can have trade-offs because it's getting a liquid product and it's more difficult to handle. And the point is that, in fact, this is not about technique, not about that we do not know how to handle. We do know this very well. Well, maybe something we don't know, but that's about the last 5%. We do know enough to handle manure in a proper way and to deal with most of the problems. But in many developing countries especially, it's a matter of knowledge, infrastructure, possibility to invest in infrastructure, in equipment, and this holds especially for smallholders. But it's also the easiness of synthetic fertilizers. Sometimes it's even subsidized, which means that, wow, why bother about the manure? It's much easier to buy a bag of fertilizers, and then you have your NPK in the right proportions. And indeed, it's also a bit more expensive to handle manure. But when you look from the national economic point of view, manure management, proper manure management is really profitable, because you don't only have the private gains of the utilization of nutrients and of the organic matter, but also the avoidance of public costs related to water quality and public health. And there are many groups active already. So it's not about the knowledge, but it's about bringing people together and to realize that things will happen. And that's also why we started an initiative under the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, under the agricultural initiative of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, where in fact we said we want a project about knowledge dissemination and about awareness to realize good management, manure management at livestock farms, based from nutrient cycling, soil carbon, but also capturing methane. And this is not only a problem at the farm level, this is also a problem at a regional scale. So it is about technique, and it's about policy, and it's about the integration between the two. But it means that we need awareness of policy workers, but also awareness of farmers, and awareness of those who are in contact with farmers, extension workers, suppliers, etc. And it is also, well, we need some knowledge, but it's more about tailoring existing knowledge and tailoring tools, tailoring equipment, etc., much more than coming to hardcore science, because that's not necessary anymore. It's also about the willingness to realize change, to be aware that manure is a problem, and that there is a large potential in improving productivity of agricultural land by utilizing manure in a proper way. And this is at the level of farmers, extension workers, and other stakeholders in the chain, especially there where the chain is well developed. but it's also to regional and national governments, especially when it comes to concentration of livestock in regions. And we need to go to this action on the ground. And the action on the ground is that with the project that we have developed under the CCAC initiative is to reach to farmers' organizations, to extension, but also to policy. And it is about creating awareness, start activities, run projects, support projects with knowledge, with information about manure management, trying to improve manure management on as many places as possible. And what will we deliver? Well, we gave it a name, the manure kiosk. The kiosk as a metaphor for a place where you can get all the information, and in this situation the information is freely available, whereas in a kiosk you have to pay for the magazines you buy. It's activities, so really support in projects, and that's not concrete yet. We are looking for opportunities. We're looking for situations where support from the manure kiosk can help to improve manure management. And so the deliverables will also be counted at the end in the number of projects that we supported, not in our own investments in manure storages or in digesters or in other equipment. And the other deliverables will be that we created a network of specialists, a marketplace, but also what we call the iKiosk, an internet place where information is available. And the outcome will be really a change in manure management on the ground. We hope that we are able to realize that, but also by knowledge, by a better infrastructure, but also by improved policy. And for this, it's not that we work on our own because we know that many people are working on manure management. So this is about networking. So we have to look at stakeholders, target groups, but also, okay, who will work with us? Who can be our partners? And, well, farmers, they're our target group, but they can also be our partners because, thank you, also the implementation on the ground requires the farmers' information to tailor the activities. But also governments, multi-governmental organizations like the CCAC, the Global Methane Initiative, and others. And that's all that we try to prevent situations like this. Well, you see some banana plants feel quite well, but in fact this is not really the optimal way manure could be utilized. And that's what we are striving at in this project. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Theun. Selam, if you would, please.
So my name is Selam Kidane. So I work for the Ethiopian government, more specifically the Ministry of Environment and Forest. My presentation would be a bit different. First, I don't have slides. We were told not to have one. And the other one, I'll be talking about more policy stuff. So hope it will be interesting. I am a policy person, so I'm getting used to the words on agriculture, but I have a passion for it, and there's a strong interest from our government. So I'll be sharing some of the things what we are doing and will be doing for the next 20 years. In general, just to give you an update, we do have both adaptation and mitigation strategy for agriculture. So it's not only on agriculture, it's like a holistic strategy on climate change on other sectors too. This is like preaching to the choir, but climate change has affected us a lot, Africa, then Ethiopia, because we don't have also the capacity to minimize the impacts on our country. So in order to change this, also like to address this, the first thing we did was like to see who is really involved in the process, to work with sector ministries that are really involved in the process. We are the focal point for following the climate change issues, but also to work with the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Water, all related institutions. So we have a team now. The point where this policy initiated is from the Prime Minister office, so there was a strong political commitment to it. So we have different structures when we designed this strategy. So there was an interministerial committee, a technical committee, more of a technical support, and a sub-technical committee for people like me that really do the everyday job and follow up. To go to the content, the idea of our climate change strategy, or the climate change strategy for Ethiopia, focused on reducing our emissions. So it wasn't that much, but the idea was in the coming 20 years, the government planned a very strong development plan with many industries, promoting agriculture, also expansion of the sector. So when we did some estimation, we saw some increase. So our baseline year for this strategy was 2010. So it was around 150 megatons of carbon. So by the year 2013, it would have reached around 400 megatons of carbon. So what we did is, if we implemented some initiatives that would help us in the different sectors to reduce our emissions, but continue to develop, or like gear up the development standards or issues. So it was initiated like that, but we found some space to make it happen. We are still doing it. This is like 2013. It's just the third year now. We are getting some lessons from what we presumed was right, but doing it wrong for the past 3 years. But things are going well. So to let you a bit the details on agriculture, the economy of the country depends on that. It employs around 80% of the population of the country, 50% of our GDP, then 90% of our exports is from agriculture. So which kind of, you can easily imagine that we have a huge livestock and very traditional way of agricultural systems. So which means our biggest emission contributor is the agricultural sector. Methane from the livestock and also the traditional way of doing agriculture has its own emission. But also the government wants to expand this system. We want an increase in the food production at least by 8% per year, so that's the government plan. So we have to identify what we can do to reduce our emission, but also promote the food security of the population, and also have increased food productivity. From just to mention some highlights from the strategy, we try to identify 2 points. So the 2 points was discussed, negotiated with the Ministry of Agriculture, with stakeholders and civil society. So the first one, as a priority with less cost, was intensifying agriculture through the use of improved inputs and better management of residue management, so that this will entail less deforestation on our forests, which would technically mean that we will be avoiding emissions from deforestation, and also creating a small, medium, and large-scale irrigation systems in the different parts of the country that are going to be affected by less precipitation. So these were some things we tried to identify within mitigation, which can also promote food security. On the adaptation part of it, on the resilient part of it, we tried to cluster it into 3 parts. So the first part will have the first 5 years of the strategy, which is from 2010. If we started from 2010 till 2015, will be the first 5 years. Then from 2015 till 2020, then from 2020 till 2025. So we have this five periods, like a cluster things. So in the first 5 years, what we will be doing on will be like short-term climate variabilities focus on current and emerging trends, or identify what are our baselines for mapping agroclimate zones. So we do have different type of agricultural zones, so it was a bit difficult. So we identified those agroecological zones and plan for adaptation, specific adaptation plans for these agroecological zones. One of the things we'll be focusing on. And also we have a federal system, so there's the federal government, and we have 9 regions and 2 city administrations. So all these regions will be doing their own specific adaptation plans, and also the city administrations will be doing this adaptation plan with the support of the government at the federal system, and the federal government will be responsible for facilitating all the policy issues they need. If we need support from other partners, facilitating this will be our role for the first 5 years. So the second term of it, from 2015 on, we'll try to identify the capacity to cope with the climate risks, how has these adaptation plans have helped us with adapting to the risks, to the extreme events, medium-term investments. Now we talk about real money being invested on the ground, really to have an adaptation plan, and also information and knowledge. So promoting this, updating them, working on climate information systems. It could be linking it up with ICTs, and so that the farmers, the local development workers at the ground, and the lowest administrative units are really updated of what the current trends are, the predictions are, which also takes a lot of technical, professional time, and also financing for that too, and also a strong coordination within the institutions, and a strong team for addressing the issue, and also having climate hazards and vulnerable groups are well identified, and we are really working to address it. Our long term will be working on identifying the real climate change threats and identifying the areas for early action. So this will be reviewing of existing climate change scenarios. So for the past, by this time, the idea is we have a 10-year experience of what really happened. So we'll be analyzing real scenarios, illustration of climate and socio-economic impact. So what will be the socio-economic impact? Are these people really, are they only affected by drought, or is there social implication? Of course, there will be going to be an economic implication. So those things will be well analyzed and well known. Then go to the microeconomic level. How are we going to address it at this macro level? And also what can we do to synthesize climate resilient activities or climate resilient activities in agriculture with development pathway. So that is vaguely some of our plan. But the other interesting thing that I wanted to mention was this policy, this strategy has one of the things I consider to be interesting is the financing part of it. So we have this really interesting adaptation plan, mitigation plan, not only for agriculture, but also other sectors too. But we need to have some body for financing it, or some facility for financing it. So not only just waiting on the climate financing, the government pledged its own money. In addition to that, we are trying to establish a climate finance, a climate resilient green economy for Ethiopia, a facility that will be responsible for mobilizing money from the government, from the private sector, from the climate negotiations, the climate financing from the UNFCCC. Such things will be channeled into that facility. There will be a responsible secretariat for doing that. So by the time when Ministry of Agriculture wants to do something on adaptation, they will not be running to the adaptation board or something. The money will be in that facility, readily available to fund these activities. So we're still working on it. We're trying to figure it out. But this is kind of the plan till 2025. Hope that was helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Selam. And now we will have Kenneth give a perspective from the farmer. Kenneth, please.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I don't have a PowerPoint, and I don't have handouts, so you bear with me. The people who have left this podium have already talked about the different technologies, so I'm not going to repeat those. I'm only going to tell you what I think we need to do for these technologies to be accepted and adopted by the farmers, because ultimately that's what we're all looking for. If you do your research in your laboratories and the farmers don't accept them, then there's no work done. So I've been working with farmers, small-scale farmers, for the last 6 years. So what I'm talking about is largely my experiences. I've seen for these last 6 years firsthand how farmers have increasingly struggled to produce under the changing circumstances, under the changing weather, with little or no knowledge. The increasing uncertainties with the climate have meant increasing uncertainties in production, increasing uncertainties in their livelihoods, and you can imagine what that means. The people I'm talking about are small-scale farmers who depend entirely on weather to produce. Not the big European farmers who can do irrigation, the guys who have to wait for rain in order to plant and sunshine in order to harvest and dry their produce. Where they used to do their prediction naturally, I remember when I was growing up, when I was a young kid, my grandparents would tell you that it's going to rain like in the next 1 week because of either the insects they see flying around or the direction the birds are taking. But now, that has almost failed. And this means that we should, or we must depend on the weather experts to tell us when it's going to rain and when it's going to stop. Now, unfortunately, most often than not, these experts don't give us particularly accurate information. They tell you it's going to rain in the next 1 week, and you wait for 1 month. They tell you it's going to rain for 1 month, it rains for 2 weeks and stops, and you have to wait for another 1 month. And you know what happens? The farmers stop believing in these things. And that's a problem. Because if you cannot predict if you can't predict weather, and you can't even rely on the technologies, then you have a big problem. Of course, there are technologies which have been developed. Research has developed several technologies. Some of them have been discussed here by Charlotte and Theun. But the issue is, how do we get these technologies to work for the person they are intended for, the farmer? These are some of the things I think we need to work, or things we need in place for them to work properly. You need a well-functioning extension and advisory system. Climate change means that we have to do things differently, not the way our old folks used to do. And for these technologies to be learned and adopted, you need a system that actually trains the farmers. And where I come from Uganda. You can see several Ugandans here. We have, the ratio of an extension worker to farmers is about 1 to, the last time I checked, I think 25,000 farmers. Now that means that you need over 5 years to visit every farmer you're supposed to visit. Or if you're going to visit everyone, you take less than 4 minutes. So you can imagine what 4 minutes will do to help the farmer. I also think we need to get the farmers, because these farmers know what they are doing. They have survived for some time, for a long time, through harsh conditions. Maybe not as harsh as this, but they have always found a way to survive. So I think as we do our research in our laboratories, we need to get them involved. for the sake of owning this. Otherwise, if you think you sit in your labs and you think for them, you may hit a dead end, and that's usually what is happening, or at least where I come from. We also need to look at their knowledge and integrate it in our research. I know we have good research products, but if you don't integrate it with the ones we have been using or the ones our grandparents were using, I think you're bound to hit a dead end. In the changing weather patterns, I think we also need farmers to access adequate and timely weather information, not the kind of weather information we get, not the above normal or near normal weather information we usually get. The farmers want to know when it's going to rain, where it's going to rain, when it's going to stop. And unfortunately, we don't get most of the time that information. And that's actually the information that the farmers need. And the people who receive this information that is currently produced, the near normal, above normal, honestly, it doesn't make good reading for me. But the kind of information we have is supposed to be transmitted to farmers by, well, mostly farm organizations. But then these farm organizations lack the capacity to interpret this information and to transmit the same information to the farmers. So we need as well to build the capacity of farm organizations at all levels. At all levels, so that they can be able to deliver these services. You can call them climate services if you want, to the farmers. Because with all due respect to government, I think the farm organizations have better structures to deliver these services to the people they are intended for, that is the farmers. I also think that we need to promote technologies, and that's according to experience, that have multiple benefits. Look at when you go promoting agroforestry. I have met farmers several times and told them, you know, you need to start planting trees in your farms and what have you, and they tell you, but if I don't have school fees for my children, what should I do? I will have to cut down those trees, sell them to pay school fees. So maybe, just maybe, we need to look at trees, maybe like fruit trees, which have multiple benefits, which have environmental benefits, but also the farmer can can remove the fruits, sell them, and get school fees for their children. Because a farmer who does not know or is not sure of the next meal will not be thinking of preserving a tree for the next 15 years. You can't forget about that. I think we also have to try to ensure or to increase the farm accessibility to credit. The notion that farmers are not bankable has been going on for some time, forever, I think. Every bank you go to, especially a commercial bank, they will tell you, well, farming is very risky. Even when there is insurance, they tell you still farming is very risky. And when they put the money for, sometimes, for example, in Uganda, they have always put an agriculture fund, I think, for the last 4 or 5 years. And this money is actually accessed mostly by the commercial farmers. So then you ask yourself, when does the smallholder farmer get some capital to start their farm, to invest in their farm? Where the answer so far is almost never. You cannot expect farmers to invest in new technologies unless they have access to financing. Then I think Salma hinted on it from Ethiopia. We need to do agroecological zoning so that farmers can know what to produce where. To assume, and this is what is usually happening, that a good adaptation technology in one area is good to another area is misleading, and unfortunately, I've seen this most often than not, and it's one of those reasons why some of these technologies have failed. Farmers also need to be assured of their markets. I've seen firsthand where you go to farms to meet these farmers in their groups, and you tell them you have to, when you do this, you're going to increase your production, and they tell you, but where do we put the produce? Because even what I'm producing now, I don't have the market. So why should I increase my production if things are going to stay on my farm and rot? So that means basically you have to look at the whole value chain up to marketing. Otherwise, then there is no incentive for them to change, because they only change. And this is what, when I hear people say farmers and are rigid, farmers don't like to change. I don't think that's true. Farmers will change if there is a reason and a profit in their change. If it's not going to make any difference financially or in their livelihoods, then they won't. Finally, the good news. The good news is that farmers actually see that things have changed, and the time I've spent interacting with them, they want to change. So we just need to assist them to know what to change, when to change, and how to change it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kenneth. I really appreciate the information and insight that we had with our four panelists. Not only did they address different aspects of the matter before us from a mitigation standpoint, from a specific case study standpoint, from a policy government standpoint, but also from a farmer's perspective. So we had a very useful cross-section of both from an NGO, from university, from government, and from farmer organizations. And I think it reflects the challenge and complexity in various aspects of what we're trying to address here. So now we're at the point in the session where we're going to open it up for questions and answers. We welcome questions not only from the audience at Warsaw University, but also the online audience. And I think we'll start with the questions from the individuals that are in the auditorium here. We'll take a few questions, and then we'll get a sense of where best to direct them for answers. So the floor is now open, starting on site here at the university. And please introduce yourself before you ask the question. Thank you.
Mark, you already know me. I don't have to introduce myself. I'm scared. My name is, excuse me, my name is Sidat Yafa from the Gambia. I work for the University of the Gambia, School of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences, and I'm a practicing farmer as well. So I have a question or comment for each of them, if you allow me. First, I will start with the farmers, because I'm pro-farmer. I know, Kenneth, you talked about the lack of proper information going out to the farmers from weather forecasting. I think the challenge becomes, how do you interpret the English language to the local languages? It's a major challenge. For example, if you use the probability clause, how do you interpret probability in the local languages? A lot of people have the difficulty to translate English language to the local languages. I think that's, that could have been the major problem. And also, you talked about involving farmers. It's a priority to involve farmers in research initiation. That's an excellent one, because the Gambia has experienced it. Currently, we have a project called West Africa Agriculture Production and Productivity. So funded by the World Bank. They're saying now, before any agriculture research should start that is funded by this project, we have to involve the farmers in the beginning. And we did that 3 months ago. We called all the representatives of all the farmer organizations in the country, where we asked them what is their need, what is their research need, what do they want to know, what is their challenges in terms of production. When they told us that, so we developed the concept note, research concept note that we are starting by January this year, the research. And also, I don't know if you have a weekly radio program in Uganda that deals with agriculture issues and climate change, because that is very, very vital too. Maybe that's one of the things that you should consider and discuss with your colleagues when you get back home, because in the Gambia we have that. I personally produce and co-host that show every week. We're running into our second year, just self-sponsored. and Mark Manis has been one of my guests for the past 7 months, 8 months. So he's been on the show live, online, worldwide, on agriculture from the Gambian perspective. For the first presenter, you talked about approaches to reducing emissions, GHG emissions. I just want clarity. How do you reduce GHG emissions by biofuel demand? I don't understand the concept. And dealing with food waste, how can food waste be used to reduce GHG emissions? And changing agricultural finance, if you can explain those things. For the second presenter, how does a cattle rancher in Africa, or who has a free-range management system, monitor the emissions, GHG emissions from livestock manure? So that's one thing that I want to ask. And also, I've seen so many presentations and so many pictures. Mostly they come from Africa or developing world. Now, I want to see pictures from the developed world as far as agriculture production is concerned, so that we also can understand, can learn, so that the audience can also understand how it is done in the developed world, rather than showing all the time only about small-scale farmers. And finally, to Selami, you said you were measuring the GHG emissions through, I don't know, from livestock, for example, or generally in agriculture. You said in 2010 you measured 250 megatons. So you're projecting to measure 400 megatons in 2013. How do you have the technology? Do you have the technology? Do you have the capacity to measure GHG emissions in your countries? So those are the questions and comments I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sadat. Certainly plenty to think about, and we'll hold all of those questions for our panelists and take a few more in, and then we'll go from there. Are there other? We've got Stephen.
Thank you. I'll just follow it on from there. And thank you. I would like to thank all the panelists and appreciate very much their contribution to this discussion.
Stephen, although I know who you are, perhaps there are others.
My name is Stephen Muaya from Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries of Uganda. I'll have only one question to the first presenter. I saw that clearly there is a very, very close, in terms of numbers and volumes or whatever it is, Africa and Europe and Russia are almost at par in terms of emissions in agriculture. I just wanted a little bit more to just ask the presenter to unpack that a little bit, just to explain how this comes so close. Because as far as I thought, I really think that it may not be the case, but I think I'm here to learn, and I would like to get a bit more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. We've got a question over here, please.
Thank you for the presentations and the opportunity to ask a question. My question goes to Uganda. I am Daibon Chibonga. I'm the Chief Executive of National Smallholder Farmers Association of Malawi. My brother, you mentioned the big divide between extension in terms of the numbers of extension workers to reach out to the farmers. So as a country or as an organization, how are you bridging that gap? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a question for Kenneth. Do we have other questions in the audience here? While we ponder those questions, I'd ask the people that are manning the online activity if we're getting any questions. Perhaps we could have a few of those, and then we'll ask the panelists to reflect upon the questions.
There was a number of discussions on the low-hanging fruit. The session today focused on mitigation options in agriculture, and then along with my Ugandan partners here on to the right of me, I quote Bruce Campbell, or Bruce Campbell was quoted, "When a farmer gets up in the morning, he doesn't think how he will do climate adaptation." What are the practical low-hanging fruit that the panel would suggest that have real impact for farmers on the ground? Can you give us a couple of examples? For instance, if 89% of the agriculture's mitigation potential is in soil carbon sequestration, then is that the low-hanging fruit, or is it actually the reduced waste management?
Thank you. I think we have a number of questions that probably we're at a point where we can pause to get some answers from the panelists. So we started with Sadat, that actually had a question for all 4 panelists. Then Stephen had a question for Charlotte on clarifying some of her admissions suggestions for Africa. Kenneth had a question from Malawi about the issue on extension. And then an overarching question for all the panelists on practical low-hanging fruit implications for mitigation options. So I'm looking for volunteer panelists to start here. Kenneth.
Okay, I can start. I didn't get the question from the online though, but I will start with the ones I got. I think Sadat was mainly giving comments, but you are right. The biggest challenge with information is interpreting it. The kind of information we get is difficult to interpret. I don't know how I can put probability in my local language, honestly. And I went to school, so what about those who didn't? So, and remember, the farmers, the majority of the farmers are rural-based with no kind of education. So you get the information and you can't even interpret it. I don't know how you expect a farmer to actually interpret it and use it. But also, the weather information about probability is not helpful to a farmer. When a farmer wakes up, they want to know whether it's going to rain or not. And if it rains, when it will stop, you know. Not whether it's going to be above normal, near normal. That's probably not. So that the kind of information, the way it is packaged, but also interpreting it is, you are very right about that. I don't know of any weekly program that talks about agriculture and climate change. I know of a weekly program that talks about agriculture, but I don't know one that talks about agriculture and climate change, and I think it's a pretty good idea. Thank you for that. Chibonga, I hope I got your name right. Yeah. How do you bridge the gap of extension workers, not having extension workers? Good question. Now, as a farmers organization, the organization I work with is totally private, so it's not, it's farmer founded and farmer run. It has nothing to do with government. We only work with government. The extension structures of government are not adequate. So as a farm organization, we try to provide extension to our members through our structures. But you realize that our membership is voluntary. I cannot force anyone to be a member. So we have about 2 million farmer members. And those are the only ones we can provide extension to. But also not very adequately because honestly our capacity is not that good in that section. So that's the best we're trying to do, but the situation is not as good as it should be, I must confess. So there is a problem there, and a very big problem, unfortunately. I think that's all I had.
Thank you, Kenneth. Theun, you had a specific question directed to you about comparing developed situations to free range in Africa, and also whether or not you'd be inclined to answer the general question from online. Thank you, Theun.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And thank you for the question about, well, it was about free-ranging or emissions from free-ranging systems. And in fact, manure is not really a problem in free-ranging systems because it's deposited in the field and you can say, okay, it works there as a fertilizer. It's there where it should be. It's in the field. It's not well spread, but you can say on the longer term, over many years, it's relatively well spread. Point is mostly when animals are confined, that large amounts of manure have to be collected and have to be stored. And one of the things that you see, and that's why don't you give examples from developed countries, for example, well, in fact, when you look to the way livestock and especially dairy and also pig production developed, manure has evaluated into liquid systems. Why? Because we had the availability of large amounts of steel, large amount of concrete, and a lot of diesel. It's based on high labor productivity with a highly mechanized system. And that's how the whole system is built. And that's completely different for the smallholder situation, which means that we know how to do it, but it's more about development, it's about tailoring, and I think they are there, but the information is scattered, and that's what we want, to collect this information and to provide the alternatives, because I think they are there or they can be developed. But the lessons from the developed for the industrialized countries, okay, it's with using a lot of energy, and we have to discuss whether that's the proper approach or not. I think it's not. And the other is that, okay, when you look at concentrations of livestock, especially in the monogastric production, okay, that's a matter of policy, and I think there countries can learn from each other, because there is a lot of policy developed in a number of countries, and that can be used indeed. And that's also why we came up with our initiative, because we say there is already a lot of knowledge, but it has to be tailored, and we need dissemination and extension. And that's also regarding your question about the extension gap. Indeed, there is a large extension gap. And when I also look at the development of agriculture in my country in the last 60 years, in fact, when you ask people, it's not that we used technique A or technique B or technique C. It's about three things, and that's research, extension, education. And this triple approach, that's the success formula, because you have to come up with new knowledge or tailor knowledge. You have to train farmers, and you have to train young people, the new farmers of the future. And you have to do this in a permanent way. And that's very, very important. And indeed, that's often the problem. And when it comes to the low-hanging fruit, well, in fact, we consider manure, okay, sounds a bit odd, but we consider manure as low-hanging fruit. Yeah, okay, yeah. Indeed.
Not literally.
No, indeed. Thank you, Mark, for this addition. That's very helpful, indeed. But I think we think that there is a large potential. And also there, it is about the infrastructure, the knowledge infrastructure, but also the other infrastructure of simple, affordable technology for smallholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Theun. Charlotte, you had two specific questions directed to you, one from Sadat about emissions and food waste, and then from Stephen about questions on your graphic of levels of emissions in Africa, and then feel free to the extent that you can, speak to the online overarching question, if you would please. Charlotte, thank you.
We'll try my best. Africa indeed has similar levels of emission as Europe and North America. However, the emissions come from different sources. Of course, it's the same level of emissions. It is very different agricultural systems. Africa, first of all, has, of course, agricultural emissions relate to land mass, and Africa is a very big continent. So if we compare it, we need to look here. I don't have the numbers for Africa, but one would have to look at the land which is actually in absolute terms farmed. It is mostly very inefficient cattle. And in fact, some countries in Africa, like Sudan, are among the really 20 highest emitting countries in looking at agricultural emissions. Much less, of course, than the US and China, the really high emitting ones. But cattle in Africa is a fairly high emitter, and in particular, manure left on pasture. And then I would agree that this is probably one of the low-hanging fruits. But I'm happy to give the detailed data that we have used here when you sent me an email. Low-hanging fruits, first to this. Soil carbon has been hailed as a low-hanging fruit. It has been mentioned by the commentator online that 89%. This number is highly contested in science. Now it goes back, there was a publication from Smith et al. In 2007, which gave a very high number, which now at least has been, there being cast significant doubt on this. And in fact, when we had for our study an expert meeting on mitigation opportunities, we had so much discussion on soil carbon and so much insecurity on whether it is in fact a really we all agree that healthy soils are needed, and that certainly enriching farming systems and soil and having a higher carbon content in soil, it's a good thing in any event, because it also increases the resilience of the soil and productivity. However, whether it is a main mitigation opportunity, that is not any longer clear. And there I would say the mitigation opportunities we need to look at diets. We need to stop eating that beef. And the big question, which is not a low-hanging fruit, but the big question is how can we get the Americas, which somehow seem to define themselves from Canada to Fireland, that barbecue is a right, the right of people, that we all need to barbecue and eat large amounts of beef. How can we change this? And, in Australia as well as an extension of this. But, and how can we avoid that whole Asia starts getting addicted to barbecue, losing A, big sophistication in cuisine, and B, increasing emissions a lot. So there is, maybe not a low-hanging fruit, but something very important with high impact. And the other thing is nutrient management. And that includes synthetic fertilizer, but also manure management. Now, the other strategies are biofuels. Biofuels is a policy-driven emission source. And there have been, over the last 10 years, in the US and in Europe, lots of misguided policies that led, in effect, to more emissions than they have reduced emissions. And we can look at the case study of the European Union, how over time it tried to fix the problems that came with the biofuels directive by requiring that biofuels come from sustainable use and putting, retroactively all kind of conditions upon the biofuel sourced, but nevertheless it had overall a negative emissions impact, in particular because of the conversion of land. So it needs to be looked at carefully, and whether what are the policies that in fact have a positive net effect, and what are the policies that have a net effect. And here we at biofuels, other than others, we are not talking about life emissions. We are talking really about a policy-driven commodity. Food waste. Generally in developed countries, people throw away processed food far too much. And in developing countries, a lot of food is lost due to insufficient or bad storage, so before it is processed. And we think one should at least, and I can't answer you yet what we suggest, but that we should look in reducing processed food waste through campaigns, through working with different partners in developed countries, because it is, it's unnecessary. It's also not a life emissions, just throwing away food.
Thank you, Charlotte. Selam, you had a question from Sadat about measuring emissions and technology. Please.
So I only got one question. Just to clarify, what I mentioned was in 2010 our emission was 150 megatons of carbon, which would have grown to, by 2030, it would have reached around 400. So that the calculation was done for the different sectors, but why we chose specific IPCC inventories per sector. So for example, for agriculture, we had a livestock specific for only livestock with cattle per head estimation. They do have good methodologies, so that's what we used. We also used that for our national communication purposes. In addition to that, we used some data were extrapolated, so it might not be exactly sure, but that's how we get the data. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Selam. The floor is open for more questions. Let's start with the auditorium. We'll take a few. Identify yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. My name is Moses Chenwa from Makerere University. My question, I think, is broad. Any one of the panelists can be able to answer it. A lot of emphasis has been placed on the potential for adaptation, potential for mitigation, and even low-hanging fruits. But as we know, low-hanging fruits cannot last and cannot cure hunger sustainably. The critical issue is capacity building. How can we shift gear to articulate true elements of concrete capacity development in Africa? For example, there is indigenous knowledge which has been overwhelmed by the climate change impacts. But currently there is science and technology. How can we be able to build capacity that can be able to help under the different circumstances for the different sectors and also for the different actors, including the farmers, including even the scientists, in the different aspects that are relevant in the modeling, in the mitigation. For example, if we say the biggest contribution is from gastric or enteric fermentation, it would be nice if a farmer has simple ways of assessing and also quantifying that assessment and then relating it to the real life situation so that the indigenous knowledge is linked. Then appreciation can be done. Finally, to illustrate my point, if you look at the picture which is on the slide up there, you see that somebody has really made the effort to carry away this manure and dump it somewhere. But there is limited capacity in how best to manage it to the next step. There are technologies, clean technologies, biocells and everything that can be used to all of those things. But we can be quick to have these photographs, we can be quick to highlight this and that, but what is lacking is a true capacity development. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. That's a far-reaching and important question. I think we have some other questions in the audience. Jerome?
Okay, first, I'd just like to thank the audience for the good questions and the panelists. I think it's been very, very good and constructive, and it's contributing to the thought process. Just a general question, and looking at the
please introduce yourself.
Sorry, apologies, Mark. We know each other well. So my name is Jerome Munsey. I'm from the Irish Ministry of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. My question is just in the title of this session, and it just goes down to the point that when a farmer gets up in the morning and goes out to his fields, he doesn't think today I'm doing adaptation or tomorrow I'm doing mitigation. He goes out and does his practices. So my question across the panel is a little bit into lines of how do you sell agriculture mitigation or adaptation to the farmer on the ground? I know as a policy level you might want to promote it, but how do you promote the take-up of both mitigation and adaptation to the farming community? Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. An important question. We have a few more questions. We'll take a couple more from audience, please.
Toby Jansen-Smith with the Verified Carbon Standard. It's maybe somewhat related to this question, but to Charlotta, in terms of the GHG mitigation opportunities from agricultural production, like enteric fermentation and nutrient management, do you think that in terms of financing and catalyzing the development of those new practices, do you think that carbon finance, whether it's public, private, or elsewise, would be a key driver for making that transformation, or do you see this as more driven by other motivations like sustainable supply chains or other value streams, and then the carbon almost becomes a co-benefit or icing on the cake?
Thank you. Take another question from the audience.
I'm Bruce Campbell, Director of CCAPS. Charlotte presented the opportunities in mitigation, and then there was a nice presentation of Theun taking up one of those. It seems like he's really on focus in terms of where the mitigation is, where you need to start dealing with it. How will the CCAC Alliance set priorities in terms of mitigation opportunities? Would the analyses like Charlotte has done be important in setting those priorities, or do you have another process?
Okay, we've had 4 questions. The first 2 are, well, they're all useful and important. Thank you for the questions. The first 2 are open to all the panelists. The first one is on capacity building, concrete examples in particular in Africa, but I presume applicable in any continent. Then, very concrete question and practical implication of, in terms of on-the-ground farming practices, how do we address the relationship to farmers of both adaptation and mitigation? Then we had a specific question about financing for Charlotte in terms of potentially carbon financing. And then we had a specific question from Bruce about, in particular, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition and setting priorities. So why don't we start with the 2 broad questions to all the panelists, and do we have any panelists that would like to address either Moses' question or Jerome?
Good. Thank you. Well, first coming to the question of Moses. In fact, it is about capacity building and capacity development. And in fact, you see, if sectors want to develop, you need huge investments in research and development and capacity building. That holds for industry, that holds for agriculture. And agriculture in Europe also developed thanks to massive investments in R&D in the last 60, 70 years. So I think that's what we need. We need investments, but okay, then we also need good extension, good people, good knowledge. So it's about training of people and not doing this for 1 year, but doing this for a longer time. And also paying attention to education of farmers. So young farmers going to school, get the proper training before they start their job. And I know that's not only about, well, getting the right teachers and having the school building and everything, but that's what we have to think about. How do we organize, indeed, capacity building in agriculture? And in fact, that's also the core of what we see in our Manure project. That's about knowledge and about knowledge dissemination and having the knowledge on the right place. It's not necessary to develop new knowledge. With the existing knowledge, we already can do a lot. And so, indeed, that's all about capacity building. And you came also, well, is it possible to have simple indicators? Yes, in a number of issues, it is possible to have these simple indicators. When it comes to enteric methane, indeed, it is related to feed intake and feed quality. And there are good indicators. But again, that is related to knowledge, because it means that farmers have to be aware of feed quality and about assessment of feed quality. And that also requires training. And then, indeed, coming to Jerome's question, well, in fact, well, no one starts, well, okay, today I will adapt. That's right. But in fact, what we saw when it comes to low productive systems in many regions, we see that improving productivity, improving efficiency in the system is a very good indicator. So in fact, it is about a farmer improving his or her business, improving feed, improving manure management, improving cultivation, and other things. And again, that's going along the road of knowledge, the road of extension, capacity building, etc. Okay, that's what I would like to.
Thank you, Theun. I'll ask the panelists first if any of them would like to address the overarching questions of either Jerome or Moses. While you think about that, we can move on. And Kenneth, did you want to? Thank you.
I mean, Theun already did a pretty good job on that. But Moses, one of the things why more emphasis is probably put on the wrong things, not just ignoring capacity. A lot of things are ignored, is because I think maybe, just maybe, the right people are not in the rooms where those decisions are being taken. Because I can assure you that if you had the right forum and the right people, and by that I mean the farmers, you would know that actually farmers or farm organizations, one of the key things they need is capacity. And unfortunately, that's where not the finances are going. So maybe my theory is that maybe the right people are not in the decision-making rooms. I don't know. Jerome, I totally agree with you. When a farmer wakes up, it's either to till their land or to plant. It's not whether, or to weed. It's not whether what they are doing is adaptation or mitigation. And from my experience, I don't think you go to a farm and start telling them that now instead of doing adaptation, you should do mitigation. No, you say, instead of doing this practice, you should do this practice. Because of changing weather, instead of, for example, plowing with a hand hoe, you can do minimum tillage, but you have to explain why you're doing minimum tillage, not the usual plowing. Now, your explanation, it doesn't matter whether it's mitigation or adaptation. The farmer doesn't want to know that. The farmer wants to know why you want him to change and what the benefit is going to be. And I don't think we are at a level yet, at least where I come from, where we have to go with a message of specific adaptation or mitigation. You know it as a trainer, but the farmer doesn't care. No, the farmer just wants to know why they should change what they are doing. And you have to do a very good explanation for them to change, and that's all right. I think that's what I wanted to say. Just wanted to share that experience. Yeah.
Thank you, Kenneth. Charlotte, I'd like to ask you to respond to the question about finance, please.
The concrete answer is, or the short answer is, I don't see a big role for carbon finance. Let me explain why. Looking at the mitigation potential and opportunities and strategies, one can see it's overall the sector is emitting quite a lot, and probably in the future the percentage of agriculture will increase, so it is important to mitigate. However, it comes from many dispersed sources, and generally, if you look at it purely from a mitigation point of view, it's a mess. You have hundreds of things to do and to achieve little emission reductions here and there. So what we do now when we look at the strategies, we actually don't look at mitigation opportunities in the first place. So we have identified the areas, but now when we go into strategies, we go much more and think, okay, what are associated agendas where there is an alignment in objectives? That is, in shifting diets, it's the health agenda. So people will shift diets, or you can create alliances with health ministries and hopefully then have a secondary impact of reduced emissions. It is the water agenda. It is ensuring that the water runoffs don't include too many pollutants, and that can help to make an argument for better use of input management. It is the productivity agenda and food security, and we need to have intensification to increase productivity. And there is, if it's done well, it has a mitigation benefit. So what we are looking at are these little changes or more significant changes, but forging alliances with other people from other sectors, with other line ministries to achieve the mitigation benefits. Because that seems more feasible, or we see it unlikely that mitigation alone will drive the process. So because mitigation alone is unlikely to drive the process, the carbon finance logic that you pay for something and then you get the tons of CO2 non-emitted in form of a credit or so is unlikely. In addition, we have the problem of aggregation. We have the problem of that the individual source of emissions is small. The individual farmer doesn't emit a lot. So bringing the actual benefit to the farmer is, in terms of monetary terms, unlikely to trigger change. So it's complicated. However, I think climate finance, and there I mean public, private supply chains, everything, is important to develop. First of all, to support research and knowledge and extension so that we know more. And then helpfully to start the processes that bring together these various actors and help to identify where are there associated mitigation benefits. And for this, to talk to you and your association, so the verified carbon standard, I don't really think it's really, there will be a lot of carbon finance and in that sense developing. It's unlikely that there will be a lot of private sector agricultural methodologies developed that create enormous mitigation benefit. But the traceability of emissions and emissions reduction, and we know that where it comes from and where it sits and where, how to get to these emission reductions is important. So in that sense, methodologies that make the whole system, including the climate impact, transparent, are definitely needed and are not existing, or very few are existing.
Thank you, Charlotte. Bruce, I'll answer the question about the Climate and Clean Air Coalition as a moderator, but also one that's involved in the CCAC. Just to give a little bit of background and context, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition is focusing on short-lived climate pollutants, and it's been in operation a little under 2 years. And what's interesting is that in the 2-year period, almost 2 years, the sector of agriculture didn't even exist in the CCAC until this past summer. So it shows, not limited to CCAC, but what we're trying to do here in Warsaw and beyond, is that we continue to need to focus on agriculture. So in Mexico City this summer, we launched with overwhelming support a sector on agriculture. So that's step one in terms of priorities, is you have to acknowledge the sector. And if you're thinking about short-lived climate pollutants and methane, as you've seen from some of our presenters, it's quite obvious that should include agriculture. The next step in the procession was, where do we begin to focus? And it's a member-driven activity, and we did agree to launch the first initiative, Theun's initiative, on livestock, in part because livestock is an issue that is applicable to all members of the CCAC. And we're about to start that process. So the first meeting at FAO will be in January to initiate that initiative. But having said that, we're also in the process of launching an initiative on rice and also on burning. So we have some catching up to do because we just recognized the sector in CCAC fairly recently. But there will be opportunities to launch other initiatives. So that's a little bit of background and context for where we are, and we see a bright future in agriculture and CCAC. I'm wondering if, at this point, There are some online questions. Our online folks, do we have any questions?
Thank you. Emphasis on extension services. A lot has been talked about information gathering, information systems. But in many of the countries, and we had a lot of farmers from Africa, from different countries in Africa, who were emphasizing already since this morning on extension services being a lost profession. What is the role of extension officers in mitigation services?
Are there other online questions at this point? Pardon me, are there other pending online questions? Okay. Well, while we consider that question about extension service, which I think is an important question, I'd like to pose some questions for our panelists to consider as we also think about this extension service question. And one for Charlotte is, perhaps you can share with us why the focus of the study that you explained was on mitigation. For Theun, I'd like to ask you to put in context your initiative on manure management and how that could be linked to the landscape approach. For Selam, perhaps you could give us some insight into the policies that you're developing in Ethiopia and how that implementation is going. And then finally for Kenneth, you did speak about adaptation, food security, perhaps some insight in terms of what's working and why and some experiences on the ground. So while I ask the four of you to consider those questions, I turn in general to all the panelists to get some of your thoughts about extension services and their roles. Theun?
Yeah, I can tell something about wild extensions. In fact, well, you know, it's quite dangerous for my job saying that we don't need research. The first thing we need is extension. But okay, we need also to do some research to keep me off the street. But in fact, if you want to have your results tomorrow, and low-hanging fruit is indeed in disseminate the existing knowledge and put most effort on that. But okay, in fact, then I'm repeating what I already said before, and but it cannot be stressed enough that we need extension and that we need good extension and continuous extension, because it's not a one-time event of learning people while giving them a training course for 3 months and then stop. It's about permanent education, and that's also what I see. If you have, at the moment, very efficient farms, very large-scale farms, they're permanently supported by extension services, by vets, by extension workers from the feed companies, by accountants, etc. So that's a permanent process and a permanent process of learning. So they are needed all the time. And in part that is public financing, and in part it can be by private financing. And when it comes to the question that Mark asked about the landscape approach, well, in fact, you can see that when it comes to manure, manure is not only an on-farm issue. It's very important on the farm, and especially from the point of view of improving productivity and utilizing all the nutrients that are there, but it certainly has its effects on the landscape, because not utilizing manure will cause a lot of problems for water quality, and also related to that to public health. And also we have to look at the uptake capacity, or in fact the capacity to deal with the manure in a region, and that's what you see when livestock is concentrating, which happens especially in monogastric systems. That is that the uptake capacity of the soil, of the agricultural land in the vicinity of those farms is not enough. So we have to find solutions for that. So it's more the spatial, it's not only a farm problem, it's also a spatial problem and a spatial policy. And from that point of view, you always have to look at, okay, what's the region, what's the capacity, what's the function of a region, and related to that, what is the room for agriculture? On the other hand, that also depends on your priorities. When food security is priority number one, maybe more priority should be given to agriculture, and there should be more room for agriculture than you can define on the basis of ecology and landscape functions. But okay, that depends on the region where you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Theun. Kenneth, perhaps you could respond to the question about extension services.
Well, when I think the question was, what's the role of extension? Why is it such a big deal? I think extension is it's a big deal. For example, the case I gave you of having less extension workers is a big deal because in my country, you need the people to go to the farmers actually to teach them about these new technologies, because the climate change, whether you're talking about mitigation or adaptation, most of these technologies are new, and new things need new ways of doing them, and therefore you need someone to teach these farmers. But also, unlike maybe in Europe, and I'm not very sure about this, you can correct me, where you have farmers connected to internet and what have you, our farmers back in our countries, most of them don't even have electricity. So that means you don't have electricity, you cannot have a computer now, can you? So that means you can't use internet. You need people, going to these farms and teaching them these new different technologies. So that's why the issue of having these systems working properly is important in this case. Because technology is not an option in some cases, in some areas, in most of the areas, I should say, where agriculture takes place. Because I think in my country, electrification is about 15%, not very sure, but rural electrification is probably even lower. So you're not going to sit in an office and send an email, that just doesn't work. So that's why it is very important to have such a functioning system, in my view. Yeah, I think the other question I will answer later, maybe. The rest can say something about that first.
Theun?
Yeah, indeed, you're quite right, Kenneth, but there's one thing that we need to add, that at the moment in our country is if a farmer wants to invest and he wants to get a loan of the bank, it means that the bank will look at his education level. And farmers need at least a 7-year education after primary school to be eligible to get a loan from the bank. So extension is one thing, but giving the basis to the new generation by education is very, very important. So that they have the basic knowledge about fertilizing crops, the basic knowledge about feeding animals, about animal health, reproduction, etc. And that's a very important one thing as well. So it's extension and education.
Thank you, Theun. Selam, if you would either address both questions, or meaning on extension, but also the question I asked you, please. Thank you.
So to start with your question, how could policy ensure implementation? If I understood it well, I guess policy is a good instrument for guiding, supporting, facilitating whatever we want to have on the ground. So it shows the government commitment, policy shows commitment. So it's like linking it to the other questions. When you do have good policies, it can support the capacity building program, or it's like your way of starting by your own, but if the support comes, well and good. If not, you will be still doing it. And also like Jerome's questions, how do you tell a farmer, like you do adaptation today, mitigation, that would be if you have a good adaptation plan, which like have identified agroecological zones, you will be telling him what to plant. So he will be meaning less risks and also more productivity. So I believe that policy is not something very far, but it it's the way how you put it in the words, so you don't have to tell them that today do mitigation or so. Those things are, I think, lead to implementation. That's how we can link it with implementation, and also with information services and extension services being a bit out of date, but I believe that better ICTs are being used. Like now the telephone access is better, so people have cell phones now, farmers have cell phones now, so that this, the very scientific, the meteorological data from the meteorological agencies can be downscaled and, you know, sent through SMS for reducing risks, early warning systems that has been used and will be used in the future. So it can has like the climate change component to it that you just have to change the name. So I believe policy facilitates all this and can lead to implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Selam. Charlotte, if you would please address my question. Thank you.
So, if you look at mitigation only in agriculture, you always have to justify why you're doing it. That's different from energy. In energy, if you look at mitigation only, it's very clear. In agriculture, it always comes with, isn't adaptation much more important? And can we touch these emissions? They are live emissions. There are a number of reasons why I think it is legitimate and needed to look at mitigation in agriculture. One is that the relative contribution of agriculture to the overall emissions is likely to increase, mostly because of two reasons. By 2050, we expect to have 9 billion people on this planet, and we hope that these are increasingly wealthy. And if we have more people and we have an increasing percentage of richer people, they will emit more. And then becomes today already, as we have seen, it's 20 to 25% of the global emissions are from agriculture, direct and indirect. That's a lot. And if this is increasing, and hopefully we manage to reduce fossil fuel emissions, you know, if we want to achieve any kind of climate goal, we need to reduce fossil fuel-driven emissions a lot, up to 90% by 2050, 2060. Then what we are left with, this is a lot more than half of what we have then, or even more, is agriculture and land use related emissions. So we need to look at it. Also, not all agricultural emissions are live emissions. Again, throwing away food is not a live emission. Misguided biofuels policies is not a live emission. And then also eating beef is not a human right. So all this has nothing to do with keeping, you know, having a good and healthy and delicious diet for 9 billion people, which is what we want to achieve, and reduce hunger and increase productivity. Now, for that reason, I definitely think it is justified. What does it justified? However, when countries, national governments devise strategies, I think they need to look at land use emissions in general, so forest and agriculture, and they need to look at food security, adaptation, and mitigation in concert. I do not think that there should be separate mitigation strategy for the agricultural sector. It needs to be integrated. And that's why when we look at this other piece of work we are doing, the development of a readiness process for agriculture, which we started under the assumption there should be similar to RED and it should have a mitigation focus. We have, in the course of doing this study, reframed in a way our terms of reference that no, this would be an unwise use of public resources to look at mitigation alone. What is really needed is an integrated process where countries look at which are the areas where our agricultural systems are vulnerable. Where do we need primarily to increase productivity? Where is resilience a problem? And where do we have mitigation gains? And this together should ideally, and then that also means that different ministries need to work together, but ideally that would lead to smart policies which are not, not agricultural policies in general in the world are not always smart, but we should improve that, should have smart policies that tackle mitigation where mitigation can be tackled and increase the resilience where this is most needed.
Thank you. And finally, Kenneth, if you could share with us some sense of what is working and some of your on-the-ground experiences. Thank you.
There are several things that have been going on in my country for quite some time, and largely it has been on the research sector, where our National Agricultural Research Organization has been developing several varieties, drought-resistant varieties, disease-tolerant varieties, if you want, rather drought-tolerant varieties and disease-resistant varieties. And I would say that the adoption of these technologies has been quite good for the farmers who have the information, because it all boils down to whether the farmer knows where these varieties are. So those who have the information, I think, have taken them up, and those who have taken them up, when you go to the farms, they tell you that they are doing good. But largely, I think it's because most of this research was done in collaboration with farm organizations. We were involved from the word go, and information has always flowed to us. So I think it shows the importance of involving farm organizations, or farmers, if you want, if these interventions or strategies are going to work. Some things, some of the adaptation technologies like irrigation, for example, as still very low. I believe we are still under 10% irrigation in my country, probably even under 5%, I'm not very sure. But the reason is because these technologies are, they are expensive to do, and it needs government intervention. And because the smallholder farmer may not be able to set up a big irrigation scheme. But I think there is a shift in the policy. I think the government is, through the Ministry of Agriculture, is looking at more and more. Maybe Steve has something to say about that. But I think the ministry the government has recognized the importance of irrigation. I think they are putting more emphasis. But so far, that has not been working well. So you have very few farmers who even do water harvesting and let alone irrigation. As far as awareness is concerned, I would say that we have quite a good level of awareness about the problem. But, if you ask a farmer what they know about climate change and what they are doing, they will tell you they know about climate change, they see climate change. And then the question is, okay, what are you doing about it? And they ask you, what am I supposed to do about it? It's the weather is changing, what do you want me to do? I can't stop the weather from changing. So they know there is that information that the weather is changing, but the nitty-gritty of what can be done is, I think, what is still lacking. Again, that is information dissemination, and that's the biggest challenge that we have. But I think there is a good job being done around research, especially to stop, rather to reduce the damage by the increasing incidences of diseases, but also the now very frequent droughts because I think in the last decade we have had maybe 8 droughts or so, and that's 20 years ago you would have 1 in 10 years, now you have 8 in 10 years. So these varieties developed by research are really doing a good job, but largely because there's a lot of involvement of farmers. So I would say that from the ground, most of the things that have worked because the farmers are involved. Most things which are done without their involvement always end up just on paper or in the shelf somewhere gathering dust and not being useful at all. I hope I've answered your question.
You have very well. Thank you for that insight. Well, what we've done here this afternoon is had the privilege of hearing from experts from various perspectives around common themes. And I want to thank the panelists for doing that. And that was ably supplemented by very insightful and thought-provoking questions from those in the room, but also online. Now we come to the challenging part. That's the rapporteur. Because so much was discussed and presented and thought about, and I can't wait to hear what my colleague Bob has been thinking and about to shortly present to, in part, distill, not fully. I understand there'll be a written summation of this panel. Bob, the ball's in your court. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, panel, and all the people who provided questions. You've all been sitting here, as I have, quietly, and some of you not as quietly, absorbing this huge amount of information and knowledge that's being traded around. And I've had the task of trying to think on how to pull these together and get some summary thoughts that fit in to the discussion that we came here today, which was talking about agricultural mitigation for landscape benefits. I think I do actually have a summary